What's the worst piece of podcasting advice you've ever got?
The worst piece of podcasting advice. That's a good one.
Dear listeners, we are gathered here today to reflect on a podcast that is no longer with us. Sam Talks Technology. The podcast shone a spotlight on the career highlights of talented entrepreneurs. Haunting us today is its host and award-winning radio presenter, Sam Sethi. Launched in 2018, 104 episodes were published in total before the show was left to perish 3 years later. On this episode, we'll learn what caused Sam Talks Technology to be yet another headstone in the podcast graveyard. We'll celebrate the highs, lament the lows, and discuss whether it should be laid to rest forever or be brought back to life. From One Fine Play, this is Podcast Graveyard. Hi Sam, thanks for haunting the show today.
You're very welcome indeed.
Let's go right back to the beginning. Why did you want to make a podcast in the first place? What's the origin story of the show?
So I was a radio DJ and I was doing an 80s music show, local radio, and somebody said, look, hey, why don't you come and do this with me? And I thought, yeah, great. And after you've played Shalimar 50 times, you really don't want to play it again. So I decided that actually technology was something I loved. For those who may know me, I studied TechCrunch Europe and I've been a technologist and somebody who loves technology for years. So I wanted to do a radio show that included technology people. And because those shows have to be recorded for Ofcom reasons, I suddenly had a recording and I went, well, what do I do with this recording? And I had no idea how to do a podcast. So I thought, guess what? I'm going to learn how to do a podcast. And I did all the same things everyone else does. What mic do I use? What's the software do I start? How do I edit it? Which is the best host? Where do I stick it? How do I get 1 million people to listen to this podcast? Blah, blah, blah. All those same problems, but it was my learning curve. So that's the embryo story of how Sam Talks Technology started.
So this was what, 2017, 2018 that we're talking?
Yeah, it's very, very early.
So you really did just sort of figure it out. You weren't copying other shows or inspired by, I really want to make a show like The Daily or...
Now I think back, the person who I probably tried to copy the most was Leo Laporte from This Week in Tech. That would probably be what I was thinking of. Could I build a technology show about what's currently going on as an interview show? And that was the basis for what I was trying to do.
Do you know, or do you remember what you hoped to achieve?
It was more about building reputation. So it was a learning curve, building reputation and reusability of my time. So the radio show didn't just die on the vine. It went out to 3 cats and 1 dog on Marlow Radio, which no one listens to. Instead, I could then fundamentally put it out as a podcast across all the different directories. Getting that recording, editing. The first editing I ever did was with Audacity. It was awful. I was looking at wave signs going, oh, I think that's roughly where I coughed. I think that's where the ad is. I think that's where that is. It was rubbish. I genuinely say it was rubbish. And then I discovered Descript and my life changed.
I think this is a good time to talk about the fact that you actually have a new podcast and that it's going really well from strength to strength. And I think you probably took a year or so off in between 2 shows. I will say that when I reached out to you about being on the show, I was tentative about whether you would agree that it was in the graveyard or not. But it seems like it's definitely in the graveyard now. So are you able to, or could you elaborate a little bit on the mourning process of letting go, and has that been impacted by being part of a new successful show?
Yeah, the show that you're alluding to is Pod News with James Cridland, but that didn't come around immediately. As you said, there was a window between Pod News and Sam Talks Technology. And I was enjoying basically working with James. And again, as anyone who listens to the first 3 or 4, you can go back there, Car Crash Radio. It was the Chuckle Brothers, you to me to you. No one knew who was doing what. It was awful. And then I decided to play the dumb questionnaire and have James as the podcast expert. So James, tell me what's been going on this week with X, Y, or Z, and then James talks, and then that works. And that's the format that we've stuck to. We have a very well structured show, and at the same time, I've gone back to doing interviews in those shows as well, which is something else I enjoyed. And so the Sam Talks Technology Learning has now been brought back into what I do with Pod News.
Great to hear. And sometimes you need to do that. The first one's a bit like a vocational degree, and then you can go out and do it in the real world. If we go back to Sam Talks Technology, let's just go back down memory lane and reflect a little bit on some of the key components of making this show, making the whole Sam Talks Technology podcast. And let's open the batting with how much time you think you spent on it, because I'm fairly sure you were a one-man podcast team. Is that right?
Yeah, I was a one-man team. I always say that the time it takes to do it is the 5 Ps, right, as I use. So preparation, there's a whole time. Who am I going to go and talk to? Then you do the actual podcast, production day. Then it's post-production. Now I've got to edit it. Then you've got to promote it. And then if you're lucky enough, you make a little bit of money off it, right? The profit part. But the reality is, I always say for a 1 hour show, or in my case, the 90-minute show, 2x or 3x time to edit it. It's crazy.
So at least a day an episode.
Minimum, yeah.
Times 104 episodes. So over 104 episodes, if you had to put a number on it, how much do you think you spent?
I'd say probably 5-6K minimum. Could be up to 10K.
So quite a big investment, especially if you track that back per episode.
Yeah.
Let's say worst case scenario, I spent £1,000 an episode or £500 an episode.
I'd say £500 an episode would be, yeah.
And that's not including your time.
Exactly.
What are your most embarrassing or cringeworthy stories from making Sam Talks Technology as a podcast?
I have 2 very good ones. One, I was asked to interview the CEO of IBM. I'd managed to get the interview. I was absolutely gobsmacked that this person had agreed, but I was super chuffed. And in my excitement, I forgot to hit the record button at the beginning of the interview. And there we are, we're chatting away and we're having a great time. And the interview I thought was going really well. And then I look down and I notice that there's no recording going on. And my little face just dropped. And I look at this guy who has given me 45 minutes of his time, which I've begged, borrowed and steal to get. And I had to say to him, I'm so sorry, but I forgot to hit the record button. Could we start again? He was gracious enough to do it, but my God, I wanted the world and a hole to open up and swallow me. So yeah, that was one of them.
It's happened to all of us. I just frantically checked that this is recording as you said that. But that has happened to everyone at least once. It's just a rite of passage, I think.
Never happens twice. Never happens twice.
What's the worst piece of podcasting advice you've ever got?
The worst piece of podcasting advice? That's a good one. That's a good one. I've never really thought of that. I guess it's spending loads and loads of money on very expensive equipment that actually you don't need. So as much as you can get good mics, you don't have to go and get a Shure MV7 top of the range when you do your first podcast, right? That is not the thing to do, right?
Spend that money learning how to tell a story. It will get you a lot further.
Exactly. And I have an expression which is called go ugly early, which is just get on with it, because the first 3 or 4 will never be perfect.
On to maybe more difficult to talk about topics. Why did your podcast die?
Died because I got bored. I got bored because the original goal was to learn about podcasting. I'd achieved that. The original goal was to connect with a whole host of people. I'd achieved that. It was getting harder to find more interesting guests. And so you go from a weekly show, which is what it was. Do you want to go to a bi-weekly because you weren't finding guests, or do you want to go to a monthly show? And I was getting to that point where I was going, no, I don't know if I want to. And then I was getting PR companies suggesting people to me. And you know that you've really gone down the wrong rabbit hole when that happens. So I was like, no, I didn't want to try and flog a dead horse, fundamentally. I was getting bored. The 90 minutes of editing, or the 3 hours of editing for the 90-minute show, was getting longer. And it just was getting less interesting for me. And I wanted to move on, which I did. So yeah, I stopped.
When you say I was at the point where I had publicists and PR companies reaching out, and you know at that point that you've gone in the wrong direction, what do you mean?
PR people generally coming to you means that, you've got on someone's radar. That's great. Don't get me wrong. But it means that, that they're just seeing you as a vehicle to slot someone in that may not even be appropriate to your audience. And if you start taking those people in because you might make 50p in a Mars bar or whatever it is from that, we might make nothing. But I just remembered I did one of those interviews, and I remember the whole of the interview going, I don't even know why I'm talking to you. I have no interest in your product. I'm shilling this for no reason. And I'm sitting here listening to someone chomp their chops about their whatever product is they wanted to market and sell to me, which is what they were doing it for. And that was so obvious to everyone listening that A, I was disengaged, and B, that this person was selling. So that was a whole bad episode in itself.
Thank you for sharing your experience of that. And I can say from my experience that the work that you put in to find a guest that will serve your audience the best or help take your audience on an ongoing journey that's related to you and what you're interested in is so worthwhile, rather than just taking the easy out of someone who approaches you because, there's nearly always an ulterior motive. There have been occasions where I've had to step in and tell someone to stop talking about their product because they say the name of their own product or book every other sentence. And that's not the point of it. What aspect of the podcast do you wish you'd focused more of your energy on?
Editing it down. I think I wish I'd focused more energy on. I think taking what I think was quite a flubby 90 minutes, I could have probably got that closer to an hour. I think 90 minutes is too long if it's just two people talking for the full 90 minutes. If you're breaking it up like we do with Pod News, with different people, different stories, different interviews in this show. And of course, at the time, there was no concept of chapters and chapterization within your podcast. So now that you've got chapters, if you don't like a certain part, you just go to the next bit that you want and you want to listen to. Whereas in the early days within the editing, there was no concept. There was ID3 tags that just didn't really work, and it was just this 90-minute block wedge of noise.
Editorial is something that once you do it and you embrace it, it really makes a difference. It's great to hear the fact that for your new podcast, you have a really tight script and you're cutting the fat, you're getting rid of the bits that are not necessary. One of the statistics that I'm a big fan of in analytics is your average listener duration, which is a stat that you can most easily get from Apple Podcasts. And it shows you in graph form where your listeners are dropping off, which is, I think, a really important piece of data. To me, it's more valuable than your number of downloads because you're seeing how much of your episodes people are listening to, and you can often spot patterns where you can then change the structure of your episode in the edit in post-production. That means that people are listening to more, and there are obviously good reasons that you would want to do that, all the obvious stuff.
Yeah, I think if you as a podcast creator remember one thing, you are being given someone else's time and attention. Make use of that and don't abuse that, because that's when you get it wrong. And I hate podcast shows that go, oh, James, what did you do last week? I went out last night and I played darts and had a curry and a blah, blah, blah. And that's nothing to do with the show, right? That I've tuned in for. And I'm like, stop wasting my time.
I hear that so often. It's the thing that people say they hate, but then the thing that loads of hosts want to do because it makes them sound natural or relaxed, or that apparently is entertaining.
Well, James and I do it right at the end of our show. We have a section which says, James, what happened for you this week? Or Sam, what happened for you? And there are genuine elements of that are interesting, like James is just going off to Mexico this week. So James, where are you going? I mean, Podex Mexico, right? I'm doing this. Okay. So there is value in asking that question.
The answers to the answers to your questions when you put it in the end of your show are all editorially sound, as in they have some relation to the listener. They aren't, I've got to go and get some washing tablets from Tesco tonight, because no one cares.
Exactly.
Sam, I think if my research serves me right, that you recorded a whole load of episodes and did all of the guest finding and the recording bit and then stacked them up in the edit And then I think that probably got a bit overwhelming and you just didn't edit them ever. Is that what happened?
Yeah, no, that's exactly what happened. I ended up getting overly excited by getting maybe 2 or 3 people agreeing to speak in a week, ending up with 2 or 3 podcasts to try and get out the front door. And then, as you said, felt very overwhelmed.
What do you think were some really good decisions that you made, but maybe too late, that other people can adopt earlier?
I think going to find sponsors, getting people who could support the show, or at least give me the money that would justify the time I was using on the show. And so, yeah, we did get some sponsors towards the end, and that was great to have them. But at the end of the day, having sponsors meant that I could, at least when I was sitting there for the few hours that I was doing it, felt at least I was earning some value from it.
And that was probably one of those things that you were a bit apprehensive about doing, and then you did it and you get over that first hurdle or onto that first rung of the ladder and you're like, oh, actually, this is nowhere near as bad as I thought it was. And as soon as you've got that first value for your show, whether that be £100 or £100,000, at least you've got a starting point.
Yeah, and I think, what's the expression? You can't be it until you see it, right? Which is fundamentally the same thing. No other sponsor thinks they should sponsor your show unless they see another sponsor's gone there first. So even if it's 50p in a Mars bar from that first sponsor, which it wasn't, but if it was, that still gave me the credibility to go to another sponsor and say, someone else has seen value in what I'm doing and is sponsoring me. Would you see value too and sponsor me too?
Sam, did you mourn its passing, or were you relieved to see Sam Talks Technology die?
I must have mourned it a little bit, because you do put a passion and a time into something. Anything that you nurture, you will feel a mourning for when they've gone. So yes, I must have done, if I reflect back, which would also describe why I thought I might bring it back at one point, thinking that I could resurrect it, because I felt that there were other interesting people I could then go and talk to outside of podcasting. Because sometimes when we're in the world of podcasting, just talking podcasting, and there was a part of me that said, I'd really like to go and talk about AI, and I did an event on AI, and I'd really like to go and talk about something else, because I have a broader technical interest. And so that was where I did think about, let's resurrect it and have a vehicle for doing it. And I had a sponsor as well at the beginning before I resurrected it. So that was going to happen. And then I just went back to, this is just going to be double, triple the work to keep the quality bar high, and also do pod news and all the interviews I do there, plus the interviews for Sam Talks Technology and the editing. No, I'm not doing it. And I parked it.
Sounds like you were relieved overall to see it pass.
I think I was relieved overall the second time to see it pass, because that was when I finally put it to bed. The first time I mothballed it, thinking I will go back to it at some point. And then the second time, having reflected, I went, no, this is not going to be the thing I do again.
From everything you've learned making Sam Talks Technology, what piece of advice would you give to a podcaster on the road to making their first episode?
It's something I didn't do. Listen to other podcasts that you want to aspire to be, right? First and foremost, because if they're a good podcaster that you're aspiring to be, they've probably gone through all the mistakes that you will make. They've probably come up with some really good structure to the show. That sounds easy because they've made it sound easy, because they've actually put a flow into the show themselves. So that's a good starting point. And I think, again, one of the other things I'd say is just understand what you're trying to achieve with it as well. Don't just do it because you can get a quick 90-minute mic and set it up and talk to somebody. Understand why at the end of 50 episodes, you're still doing it. And I think that's probably the hard questions you have to ask yourself in the beginning before you actually sit down and actually record.
There's some great wisdom in there. And these are questions that when I work as a producer on a podcast, I often ask. One of them is, to your first point, is what other shows have you listened to? What did you like and what did you dislike about them? Because those can become the building blocks for what you're doing. Another is, what are you trying to achieve? And one of my favorites, which is a really difficult question, but it's so important to think about, is how does this podcast end? We're not all Joe Rogan. We're not all signing up to just do podcasts indefinitely forever. I know I'm definitely not. So what is the plan for how it's coming to a close? Because if you can understand that, then you can shape the journey on the way. And it gives you, the listener, guests, all sorts of other people involved in the project, some framework for where it's going. And I think that is a really good thing to do alongside working out what you're trying to achieve.
One of the other things I wish I'd done was created series, which would have given me pregnant pauses in the podcast that would have allowed me to do what you just said. End a series, take 3 months off, forget about it, don't have that pressure of that weekly beat, and then come back with series 2, series 3, series 4, and maybe even change the series structure because it's a new series, or change the way that you actually do the whole show. So I would, if I look back, again, one of the other things, probably in hindsight with knowledge, which is always easy, have said, yeah, instead of killing it, maybe have done 25 shows, called it series 1, stopped, done another series, having taken some time out. You know, that again is just hindsight.
And a much debated topic, because frequency of posting is a thing you should really think about. Building limited series is a thing that people don't embrace enough. Make a show that's 6 episodes or 8 episodes and treat it like it's a body of work, and don't feel like you're obliged to make ongoing indefinite episodes. If there's a story you want to tell, or a journey you want to go on, or something you want to explore, make it and be proud that you made that body of work. We talked about Ricky Gervais earlier on. He's well known for this. He made The Office. It's 3 series of 6 episodes, and that's it. He then made Extras. It's the same. He then made a different comedy. He made a whole load of different bodies of work that are finite. He didn't feel an obligation to turn it into a long-running TV series that goes on for decades.
Which is also one of the other things that I learned along the journey. Your listeners aren't there actually to listen to your guest. They're there to listen to you, which is a really weird thing to understand. You think that if I get the greatest guest, then my listeners will be excited, and they will. That's always a good thing to do. But actually, your fans, rather than your listeners, are the people who will turn up. Whether you, in the case of Ricky Gervais, we turned up to The Office, he stopped it. We mourned the end of The Office, but then when he came up with his next show, we were fans of Ricky Gervais, so we then followed his next vehicle and then the vehicle after. And as a podcaster, sometimes you have to accept that it's you that they are coming to listen to rather than the guest. And that's something that as well, I think people forget.
That's super interesting. I actually wrote on my pad early on in our conversation, when you were telling me about getting Sam Talks Technology off the ground, about the importance of building brand and how it's not just these episodes. There is a brand around it. You need to understand who you are and the role that you're playing. And what you're saying about people turning up for you is so important. And in the words of someone who has done that whole personal brand build so well, we have a closing tradition on this show where we ask you, if your podcast had a headstone, what would you put on it?
Play it again, Sam.
Oh, amazing. Perfect. I love that. So that just leaves us with the task of making a final judgment about Sam Talks Technology. Should it be resurrected? Are we sending it to the podcast heavenly afterlife? And I think we will both agree that on this occasion, Sam Talks Technology should stay firmly where it is, in the graveyard.
I do. I agree. Yeah, that's where it will go.
I don't see that there's anything from the show that really stands out as being a vehicle for bringing it back. It's not an extraordinary format. You have a new platform for building your own character. You have a new show and a new way of expressing yourself in a more enjoyable setup. So I think it was really good for learning and really good for understanding how you make a podcast and going on this journey of discovery. But yeah, I think this one should stay in the grave. Don't bring it back.
Thank you. It won't be.
I really appreciate your time. Thank you for joining me today and giving Sam Talks Technology the service or memorial that it really deserved.
Thanks, James.